It's very awesome that we are able to learn from so many guests who are willing to come all the way up to Ely and share their expertise with us. And Mr. Ernest Scheyder is a senior correspondent for Reuters, covering the green energy transition and the minerals that undergird it. He previously covered the US shale oil revolution, politics, and the environment. He's a graduate of the Columbia Journalism School, and he is here to talk to us about his book, The War Below. Please join me in welcoming me.
Today, and thank you, Lacey, Battery Waters Connect, for the opportunity to be here. It's great to be back at Ely, and thank you also to the staff of the Grand Ely Lodge for hosting us during by design, I think. But this is better.
Yeah, you can turn it up over there too.
I was just saying,
it's great to be with you all. Thank you, Lacey. Thank you, Battery Waters Connect. Thank you to the staff of the Grand Ely Lodge. It's great to be back here in Ely. And thank you also to our friends at Paragus who are outside with copies of The War Below. Great to have them be part of our day today. As Lacey mentioned, my name is Ernest Scheyder. My day job is at Reuters, where I write about the critical minerals that power the green energy transition. I've also recently published a book called The War Below, Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. And great to be with you all to talk with you about it today. Ely is a core part of the book, as well as many other proposed projects in the United States and around the world that would supply the building blocks for our green energy transition. I had the pleasure of spending a good chunk of time here 2 years ago to meet with folks across the spectrum about this transition and what it means not only for this community, but also for our country and our world. And my interest in this space began when I started at Reuters. I joined Reuters in New York almost 15 years ago. And at the time, we started to hear various machinations about this thing called fracking, which at the time sounds a lot like a bad word. Not a lot of people knew what fracking meant. And it was due to a big technological innovation related to hydraulic fracturing, as well as horizontal drilling and other things that was really making the United States become curious as to what it would mean to increase more of its own oil production. And so we saw places in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Texas and Colorado really start to increase their production. And I, as a journalist, started writing a lot about the area and really spent a lot of time in a lot of those states. And then in 2013, 2014, Reuters came to me with an offer I couldn't refuse. They said, why don't you go move to Western North Dakota? And I either lost a bet or pissed somebody off, but Reuters sent me out to Wilson, North Dakota, where I spent about 2 years. Fascinating experience. Thoroughly loved it, actually. I'm from Maine originally, so I enjoy the cold weather. I enjoy being in rural parts of our country. And being there was an opportunity to really see how a major technological innovation and revolution could transform American energy. And indeed, we sit here today with the United States being the world's largest oil producer. The United States today produces more oil than any country in history. That means more than Saudi Arabia has ever pumped out of the ground, more than Venezuela, more than any other country. And after about 2 years in North Dakota, I was looking for a change and decided to move to Houston, where I was writing about Exxon and Chevron and OPEC. And what was going on in North Dakota really frightened a lot of OPEC ministers. They were seeing that this tiny state that was losing people before this technological innovation was pumping more oil than some OPEC members. And so I got to write a lot about that. But then around 2016, 2017, I became really curious about the early waves of the green energy transition, especially as it related to technology for electric vehicles. And so an opportunity came up to start writing about copper and lithium and nickel and cobalt and other critical minerals. And in 2018, that's where I switched my attention full time. And I immediately started to notice some contrasts with oil and gas. Whereas I feel oil and gas tends to elicit very strong responses from people. People tend to either say, I think oil companies are sending us to hell in a handbasket, or they're having huge positive net benefits for our economy and our world. I mean, I grant you that, yes, there's a murky middle, but people tended to, in my professional experience, fall into one or two baskets. But when it came to lithium and copper and other critical minerals, people generally said, sure, I think that's great. That's awesome. I love my cell phone, whatever, cool. But when it came to specific projects, especially for lithium, I noticed that folks tended to say, hey, like, this is a space that's sacred to this particular community or to ecological concerns. We don't want to have this here. And when you contrast that with what the IEA and EIA and other organizations in the US and elsewhere were saying were the sheer demand for these critical minerals, I became very curious around, okay, where are we going to get the building blocks if we want this energy transition? If we want to have laptops and lights and cell phones and so many other things that power our everyday lives. And so the book really is an exploration of that idea. It's an exploration of this idea of choice. What are the choices that we're willing to make if we want an energy transition? Are there some places too special to mine? If we do mine, what are the standards by which we would allow mining? And we're not really having those discussions right now. I did not see them at all. I don't see them here today. And so I really want the book to be part of this broader discussion and to really help people understand the complexities of these spaces and how it's not as simple as we might just assume. There's no free lunch, so to speak, which might be the wrong phrase for people that just paid for a lunch. But and like I said, and these areas are extremely complex. The organization that I work for, Reuters, international news agency, obviously has a lot of resources across the world. The book focuses specifically, though, on many projects in the United States, and that was a conscious choice because I wanted folks to have to grapple inside our country with it. I don't think for a long time many people in the United States have had to think about where the stuff comes from when they show up at a store and buy it. But I do think 4 years ago, what did we had? We had the onset of the global coronavirus pandemic. And y'all remember we had to wear masks for a while. And we all discovered that masks weren't made in the United States. People were shocked to learn that this sort of most basic yet essential piece of medical equipment was not made in our own country, even though it had been for a long time by a Minnesota company, 3M. And so that's just one example, I think, of the way that globalization has affected the production of our everyday lives. So when we think about the green energy transition, we think that we just sort of extrapolate that on a much broader scale. This is not just about masks. This is about where we get the building blocks for so many of these electronic gadgets and gizmos. I mean, I see a few laptops just out there here in the audience right now. We all have cell phones, et cetera, et cetera. And where the building blocks for those materials come from matter. And I really wanted folks to have to grapple with this. An extreme example is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Oftentimes, sadly, there can be children as young as 6 or 7 that are part of the supply chain. I feel I speak for everyone in this room when I say nobody supports child labor. And I'm not saying it's that black or white, but in some ways it kind of is. If we're not thinking about the transparency of these supply chains, well, then what do we expect of the manufacturers from which we buy the products that we use every single day? And so that is some of the complexities that I wanted to explore here in the book. But I would say that it's not a book for geologists or investors. It's a book for everyday Americans. It's for your Aunt Edna in Cedar Rapids. It's for your cousin in San Diego. I wanted everyday Americans to have to say, okay, what are the choices that I'm willing to make? And what are the choices that I put on my policymakers and tell my politicians and others and elected officials that I want them to make? Because by not deciding or not grappling with these, it's a state of inaction, and inaction is a choice. And so by getting to meet the various people through all of these projects that I propose in the book, you hopefully get a sense for who they are, what makes them tick. And it's not just one side versus the other. There's obviously many, many sides to this issue. And I did a lot of what we call shoe leather reporting, places across the country and across the world, really to try to help the reader understand the 360 degrees of the angle here. And I wanted to take this beyond electric vehicles. Can I ask a show of hands, who in here owns an electric vehicle? Sure, hybrids count. Okay, we've got a handful of hands here. And I should say off the bat, I do not own an electric vehicle. But what I do own is a leaf blower. And hang with me here. Leaf blowers historically have been powered by 2-stroke engines. And 2-stroke engines are really bad for the environment because you mix gasoline and oil, and they just, in the combustion, spew out this horrible mix of pollutants that are just really bad for the environment and contribute to the global warming effects. some governments across the world are outright banning them. The city of Washington, D.C. has outright banned them. California is phasing them out. Several countries in Europe are phasing them out. And so the common rejoinder is go electric. A lot of people say, hey, like, you should not do a two-stroke engine leaf blower. You should get an electric leaf blower. And so that's what I did. I got an electric leaf blower. And I tried, because I was writing this book, to figure out, okay, well, where did the lithium come from inside this leaf blower? Where did the nickel come from? Where did the copper come from? What about the cobalt? And I got to tell you, I have a lot of resources at my disposal, especially with my day job. I couldn't figure out where any of these critical minerals came from. And so that's why this topic is about so much more than just transportation. It's about all of the gadgets and gizmos in our everyday lives that are powered by lithium ion batteries that weren't powered by them even 5, 10, 15 years ago. And so there's a chapter in the book that looks at this idea of a leaf blower, because I wanted the reader to sort of understand this is about so much more than electric vehicles. Most of the people in this room did not raise their hands when I asked to get an electric vehicle, but you all have many devices in your house powered by lithium ion batteries that you didn't have 10 years ago powered by lithium ion batteries. So these are some of the things that I really hope readers think through more. It's not just a topic you can say, oh, I'll never own a Tesla. Well, I mean, you have a battery powered device in your house, multiple ones, and the sourcing of those critical minerals and where they come from matter. Several of the projects that I look at in the book on purpose are sort of strung together in a narrative fashion to illustrate this picture. The main storytelling device that I use is about this rare flower found nowhere else on the planet that loves this deposit of lithium about 200 miles north of Las Vegas. And so right away you get the tension baked in. What matters more, the lithium or the flower that's there? Can the mine and the lithium coexist? If the mine was developed, would this flower go extinct? And what would that say about our approach to biodiversity? And so you get to meet the people on both sides of this issue. There's a executive chairman of a company that would like to develop this project. And he actually used to be in the oil and gas industry. And for him, the building of this mine is his way to make penance, his way to help leave the planet cleaner than the one he found for his children and grandchildren. On the other side, there's a conservationist that says, sure, I'm not opposed to lithium mining, whatever, but what matters is biodiversity. What matters is saying that we need to protect what's on this planet. And if we let this flower go extinct, what's next? Is it a tree? Is it an animal? Is it something else? And so it was such an amazing contrast there between these two approaches. I use it actually as the spine for about 3.5 chapters of the book. And so helping folks to sort of think through that there. Another proposed project I look at is the Resolution Copper Project in Arizona, which some of you may have heard of. This is a deeply complex space involving indigenous rights, involving local economic development, involving the inaction of Washington to make a concrete decision. And it was my honor to spend a lot of time with the San Carlos Apache people, as well as the residents of Superior, Arizona and elsewhere to tell their story. And I'll let you explore their journey in that chapter. A chapter is about the boundary waters. And I should say we will have time for Q&A at the end, and I think we can dive into that as well. But I'm very thankful for folks, several of whom are in the room, gave their time and insight for this really in-depth chapter looking at this issue, which you all live, of course, every day here in Ely and in northern Minnesota. And I do have a chapter that, bear with me, it's about mining certification schemes, which sounds wonky and nerdy and might put you to sleep. But what I didn't want is telling you, the reader, that we're going to need a lot more of these critical minerals, but we're having all this opposition or consternation or just tough choices to be made, and you just to throw up your hands and to say, okay, hey, this just stinks. Like, we're never going to come to a resolution here. And so I discovered that about 15, 20 years ago, this organization known as IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, was founded by Tiffany, the company that makes the jewelry, the iconic jewelry. There's a movie made about it. They have the jewelry in the little blue boxes. Tiffany had a problem, though, about 15, 20 years ago. It knew that people saved, sometimes for months or years, for engagement rings. What it didn't want is to buy metals from places that it didn't fully understand. It didn't want to get a leaf blower from where it didn't know where the lithium came from. You'll extend the analogy. And so it formed this organization known as IRMA to basically audit mines. And its goal was to put tons of different groups of folks together, including mining companies, investors, labor unions, conservationists, and others, put them in the same room and say, okay, what's the best way to create or to basically to operate a mine? And they came up with these standards by which they audit mines that are currently in operation. And so as we sit here today, y'all can load the IRMA website and you can get the IRMA audit report for the Albemarle lithium mine in Chile, largest lithium facility in the world. And you can figure out exactly how they interact with the host community, how they pay their people, how they use water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we're starting to see more companies like Ford, like BMW, and others say they're only going to buy critical minerals from IRMA audited mines. And so it was a way to sort of bring to the reader, you all here, this idea of, are there ways to move mining projects forward if we're going to allow them in certain areas? And so I think that has to be part of the conversation here as well. And that was a fun chapter because you get to sort of unpack, I don't know if fun's the right word, but fun for me as the author to write it, because you get to sort of unpack what are some potential solutions here as you think through what you want here as a reader. The recycling has to be a part of this. I mean, the unfortunate reality of internal combustion engines is once you put gasoline in there and burn it off, you obviously can't reuse it. It's burnt off. But all these critical minerals can be reused again in various fashions. We need to think through how we design products and what are the ways in which we collect old equipment for recycling. And so I have a chapter where I got to talk to two leading industry recycling CEOs and share their vision for how a recycling network could be built out in the United States. Many of you, I'm sure, have a drawer full of old cell phones at your house. I know I'm guilty of that. I have about 2 or 3 just sitting there. Now just amplify that across our country and think of all the copper that's just sitting in your kitchen drawers. And so I'm sitting here today telling you that your kitchen drawers are one of the largest sources of copper in the United States right now. So I would encourage you to do something with them. You can definitely get money for them. And more information in that chapter of the book. I want to talk about 1 or 2 more chapters and then do a reading, and then we'll throw it open for some questions. But a question I get a lot is, okay, do we need all these critical minerals? Like, sure, I see what the IEA says, but are we actually going to need a lot of these building blocks? Are these projections serious? Or should we just, slow down a little bit? And I push back a little bit on that because it's not my job to answer that question. It's your job to actually answer that question, to think that through and have a discussion amongst us as Americans, and that would hopefully spur conversations with elected officials. But I did have an opportunity to spend a lot of time in northern Nevada at the mine site for the Thacker Pass lithium mine. This is a mine that is being developed by a company known as Lithium Americas. And you read during the chapter how I sort of drove up there in the middle of nowhere, camped out for a night or 2 with this guy who advocates for deindustrialization. And it was a fascinating opportunity to see this issue through his eyes. He is partnering with some indigenous groups opposing this mine. And he says that his perspective really is to get rid of lights and electricity and go back to an agrarian way of life where we fish and farm and live off of the land. And that's the way to fight climate change. His idea, in his words, changing what's under the hood is not a way to stem carbon emissions. Agree with it, disagree with it. It was a perspective that I felt was interesting to put into the book. And this gentleman ended up on the front page of the New York Times. The New Yorker has written about him. So it's getting out there into the common parlance more and more. And I wanted, again, to bring this idea to the reader to say, hey, like, this is part of the choice that we're making as well. Is it, we think that the best way to fight climate change is to just stop industrializing our planet and to go back to the way we lived 150, 200 years ago. And so you get to explore that there as well. And lest we think that this is an issue just for people in rural areas, I do have a chapter focused on a proposed lithium mine right outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, which has caused a lot of consternation. This is a mine that would supply Tesla, Elon Musk, and I've got some exclusive bits in the book about how he personally ordered his staff to go and make a contract with this company before they even had permits, before they even talked to local officials, because that's how hungry Elon Musk is for lithium. But the problem for Elon Musk and the problem for the company is that they didn't tell anybody what their plans were in the local community right outside Charlotte. And so you can understand, and indeed you do learn when you read this chapter, how that did not engender goodwill with the local community at all. And so for me, that sort of crystallizes how important it is to have a more informed local community when it comes to a lot of different extractive projects there. That's a broad overview of the book, what led me to write it. I'd like to read a little bit from the beginning of the book that hopefully will whet your appetite, and then fuel a round of questions, and then we can go from there. So this is from the prologue, which is titled A Discovery. A glint of light caught Jerry Team's eye late one afternoon as he drove through the cragged Nevada landscape and into the encroaching dark. The New York Botanical Garden had sent the 31-year-old botanist to collect samples of Nevada flowers and other vegetation for its library of plant samples, known as an herbarium, the largest of its kind in the Western Hemisphere. Team's assignment was simple: find odd, unique, colorful, and hopefully undiscovered plants. He was then to flatten them using a press he kept in the back of his truck, store them between sheets of newspaper, and send them to New York, where they would be glued to large sheets of white paper, studied, cataloged, and preserved for future generations. If any plants were found to be interesting, more scientists would be sent out for further research. Then, as now, Nevada's flora has long been the least explored in the United States. More is known about plants and flowers in remote Alaska than the jagged desert corners of the sagebrush state. To me, it was a dream job, recalled Team, who studied botany at the University of Nevada, Reno, partly to avoid being drafted for the Vietnam War. Nevada has always been the last frontier for plant collection, he said. It was May 18, 1983. Ronald Reagan lived in the White House. The Space Shuttle Challenger had its maiden launch the month prior, and telecom provider Ameritech was preparing to make the world's first commercial cell phone call. 6 years prior, a scientist at Exxon, yes, that Exxon, invented the lithium-ion battery, a feat that would eventually revolutionize the world's economy and its fight against climate change. It was also an invention that would link directly with Team's Nevada work that day, work that would attract one of the world's largest automakers, stoke the ire of America's most preeminent conservation groups, and spread worry through the corridors of power in Washington and Wall Street. Team was very much unaware of that future as he guided his burnt orange-colored Chevrolet Blazer down a steep embankment of gravel, barely recognizable as a road. All the botanist could think about was finding a safe place to camp. Those barren hills of Nevada, known as the Silver Peak Range, were not forgiving for those without a plan, especially in the Stygian dark. But that hint of light flickering ahead of the dusk beckoned Team. Amid what looked to be unusual light patches of ground surrounded by a sea of darker rock, the botanist noticed a wildflower that hugged the earth, almost like an herb. Stems of about 6 or so inches protruded from the soil, with leaves of a bluish-gray hue and flowers of pale yellow. Hundreds of the plants seemed grouped together densely at the site known as Rhyolite Ridge, but Team was unsure why. He had stumbled upon the plant at the peak of its blooming season, from May to June, when the golden flowers emerge resplendent for nature and dazzle the bees, spiders, and other creatures that pollinate it in the seemingly barren desert. By July, the flowers turn red with age and begin to cast off ripened seeds, propagating their next generation. Late summer brings a hibernation that lasts through the next year. So, Team followed procedure. He collected 15 samples of the flowers, pressed them, labeled them, and cataloged them from New York out of the bed of his truck. He pulled out his tent and camped for the night under the wide expanse of the Milky Way. Back east, months later, Team was reviewing his field notes and still could not identify the plant. But James Reveal, a University of Maryland professor who had studied his notes, wrote to say why. Team had likely discovered a species of plant previously unknown to science. So Reveal, Team, and a group of other botanists visited the site the following summer and collected even more samples. In 1985, Reveal announced his findings to the world in an academic journal. And in honor of its discoverer, the plant was given the moniker Ergonum Temi, or Teams buckwheat. A small plant, Teams buckwheat looms large in the green energy transition. Beneath the roots of that plant, the team first discovered during that warm spring day sits a massive deposit of lithium, which is used to make lithium-ion batteries that power millions of consumer electronic devices. While Team would eventually have 7 plants named after him, it is Team's buckwheat that grows only in those lithium-rich soils of the Nevada hills and nowhere else on Earth, for reasons that rank among the many mysteries of the plant kingdom. When I visited Team in Reno in the summer of 2022, he wore white New Balance sneakers and was dressed in a white Hawaii 5-0 t-shirt tucked into his navy blue shorts. A pair of reading glasses rested on top of his balding head. Fit and trim, Team's youthful physique and sharp mind belie his 7 decades. He had no plans to retire and cede his unofficial title of Nevada's premier modern botanist and plant explorer. Now, Team had been teaching at the University of Nevada, Reno since 2014, and before that, he was a bellman and a limousine driver for 3 of Reno's casinos. He often would take long weekends away from the slot machines and poker tables to explore the state's remote landscape. In 2016, though, an Australia-based company was hunting for gold in Nevada and realized that Rhyolite Ridge contained lithium. If it could be mined, it would be wildly profitable, just as global demand for the white metal was set to spike. Electric vehicles from Tesla and others were increasingly seen as key tools to fight climate change. To get at that lithium, though, would require the company to dig an open pit mine right where Team found the flowers. Thus, the paradox. What matters more, the plant or the lithium beneath it? This is a story about that choice, and the choices facing other regions of the world and the United States, replete with lithium or copper, nickel, rare earths, or cobalt, metals critical to the construction of solar panels, electric vehicles, batteries, wind turbines, and an array of other products heralded as key to electrifying the world's economy and easing carbon emissions. Team would later call it blind luck that such a rare plant sat atop this giant reserve of a key battery metal. But if that's the case, an industry hungry for lithium would surely call it a misfortune. Throughout the world, supplies of metal sit atop land considered sacred, or too special, or too ecologically sensitive to disturb. Whether these lands should be dug up in an attempt to diffuse climate change is one of the defining questions of our time. For the United States, which has less than 5% of the world's population but consumes almost 17% of its energy, this new green energy economy requires a collective reflection to which many are not accustomed. Other governments, too, are grappling with this transition, including China, which has 18% of the world's population and consumes about a quarter of its energy. Jerry Team's discovery on that quiet Nevada hill in 1983 is emblematic of the stark choices at hand and a harbinger of the fight to stem climate change. Team told me that he's now botanically immortal. Years after I'm dead, he said, people will still be talking about my discovery and its implications. Jerry Team had no clue just how right he was. Thank you. I'd love to take questions. And I should say, as I alluded to in the talk, I glossed a little bit over the proposed project here in the community because I figured it would be a strong focus of our Q&A time. So happy to talk about that or anything else.
I'm really interested in the fact that you wrote about the resolution copper mining
Okay.
and Apache wheat and the
Yes.
Apache tribe. I had come from here believing that we should not mine in water-rich environments. What I have learned is that we also should not mine in water-poor environments if that's going to affect the water table and other issues. So could you talk a little bit about the problem with the resolution mine?
Yes. So, well, just in terms of water, Arizona's been in a drought since the early 1990s, and copper mining, mining in general, but copper mining especially requires a lot of water to help process. And so one of the concerns is that if resolution were built, it would severely deplete the already low levels of groundwater that are in that very, very arid region. And of course, then you overlay the concerns about who gets access to the Colorado River in the US Southwest. I mean, the politics of water there are legendary. And so that's a huge concern there as well. And so, yes, this tension between is there too much water, so we shouldn't mine here, or there's not enough water, so we shouldn't mine here, is part of the broader discussion around whether we should be producing more in our country, really.
I'm wondering if in mining, if they could have a smaller footprint so that they might still be able to mine but not do so much surface damage. And I get a lot of emails from like indigenous natives about lithium or copper or whatever, mining in their sacred sites and all that. And so I can't help but wonder if mining can't have a smaller footprint, and if they can also think about water reuse, like, do they reuse the water? You know, they've got to have wastewater, can't they reuse it again? So that they don't keep depleting and stuff. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, I'll take the second one first. Many mines do reuse and recycle their water, especially in very, very arid regions. You see this most prominently in Chile, which is, northern Chile is a huge copper producing region, and lithium, and their recycling is a huge part of what they do. I would also say that each mine is unique and different, so each mine will sort of operate based on their specific conditions in their specific regions. So I hesitate to paint with such a broad brush, but yes, water recycling it is a key focus of the industry, and the industry acknowledges that it needs to make it a key focus in order to continue to earn such a license to operate, as well as just have enough water. And so that's there. And then your first question on size of mine, I would say again, that's a little subjective. I mean, each company spends a lot of time on engineering, on permitting, on other facets that tend to be locked in once you get a permit approved. But there have been occasions, and I do mention several in the book, where mines have initially run up to local opposition and have either reduced their footprint or sort of changed how they would mine altogether in response to pressure from either local communities or regulators. And so, yes, it can be done. There's just various factors to go into it. Beyond local social license to operate, you also have economics. At some point, you've got to weigh you are producing a commodity versus where you expect the price of that commodity to go in the future, and so it might not be worth it to make it smaller, so you might just not do the project altogether. But all of these are very site specific and subjective decision points.
Thank you for being here. I'd like to hold off to this because I have a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
Did the research that you did for this book include some of the previous studies that were done in different parts of the country? And what were the outcomes of the research? And leading up to the next question would be, what was the community's decision and the outcome after whatever mining was done, whether it was positive or negative toward the environment or the community itself?
Thanks for the question. Could you be a little more specific? What studies you're referring to?
Well, in the case of copper and nickel and other precious metals, and including lithium, does your book include any of the research that were done in different areas? As for example, here in Minnesota, there was a big thing about around the Birch Lake area that under mining underneath Birch Lake, and all the research that had been done before that, and that was done years ago. In which case it was found that the effect on the boundary waters or the effect on the local community was below the minimum standards already by the U.S. government. And so that type of thing those type of mining operations could go ahead and continue the exploratory mining, etc. And so that's the kind of previous research that I'm talking about. Do you have any of that included when you were writing your book?
Yes, I mean, I cite several academic studies in there, both on all sides of this issue. And so I would definitely encourage you and invite you to explore that chapter. What I did do, and what I consciously did not, let me back up. What I consciously did not do for the entirety of the book was make it numbers heavy or too academic. I mean, I front load the introduction with the projections on critical minerals demand on purpose. I wanted the reader to sort of get hit right away with this, and then you get to meet the people during the rest of the book that are on all sides of this issue. So yes, I do in various chapters refer to what some specific either sociological or economic experts might say, but those almost fade into the background, and you get to meet the people on all sides of these issues and sort of what makes them tick. And you really get to humanize the narrative there, because I wanted to avoid making this like a Wall Street analyst report, and I wanted you to say, okay, hey, I get to meet XYZ person here who has been fighting this mine since the 7th grade, and sort of what makes this person tick, versus and you get to meet this person who really wants to bring jobs back to her community because she's the mayor of the town, and what does that look like for her? And those are just sort of two examples of two people in the book, but I really wanted to humanize the issue here. But yes, I mean, there's plenty of academic and other scientific reports cited throughout the book. I mean, I think I've got 90 pages of footnotes, probably more footnotes than I should have included, but better safe than sorry. But at its core, I really wanted to humanize these issues, and that required getting to actually get inside people's heads and sort of explain to the reader what makes them tick.
Thank you.
Sure.
What are your thoughts about Prove It First, which is being discussed in Minnesota? If you can hear this.
Thank you for a very interesting talk, and it sounds like a very interesting book. You mentioned a couple times the concept of a social license, and I want to give you an opportunity to kind of expand on that, especially if you could also talk about the idea of a good neighbor agreement.
Sure.
Along with that, I appreciate that, because I think the idea of a social license is really important.
Yeah, and it means different things to different people, as it should, I would say. I mean, I would say that social license to operate might differ for every single person in this room, but ultimately, at the end of the day, if we're going to use this sort of room as, you know, an analogy for our country, we all have to make a decision of what we want or don't want. And so that means, what does the local community want? What are the standards by which we would sort of allow to mine to move forward, even if a local community doesn't have full acceptance of a proposed project? Would you move forward if you have 90% or 80%, or would you need 100%? What does that look like? What does it look like to make sure that local police and fire are properly remunerated for the increased services that they're going to need? I think these are all things for local communities have to grapple through. I will say that one of the knocks against the book, and I actually sort of, this doesn't bother me because I wrote it this way, is that people say, we don't know what you think about mining. And I did that on purpose, because it's not, I've really felt that I wanted to bring the complexity of these issues to the reader and to say to everyone else in the room, it matters a lot more what you think. What does a social license to operate mean for you? And what do you demand of your elected officials? Because I think that's the more important thing here. I mean, I had the privilege and the honor, really, of spending time with folks on all different sides of proposed extractive projects. And obviously, I have my opinion. Human beings have opinions, but my opinion matters less here than to say that you have to be making a decision about what you want. We're not having those decisions right now. We don't even know what its social license to operate is, because we're not collectively grappling with it. And so the one argument that I do make in the book is I take the reader by the shoulders and I say to her or him, you've got to be thinking through the complexities of these issues, because we're not doing them now. And so that's the main argument that I make in the book, and say, what are the standards of which you would allow mining? What is the social license to operate for you? What could that look like in your host community? The industry is grappling with this, policymakers are grappling with this, and others.
So, excuse me, going back to the deindustrialization idea, it seems to me that like a lot of these problems come from juxtaposition of industrial capitalism with our natural resources and our spaces. And I think a lot of the discussion about these topics comes with a presupposition of capital growth and expansion. So complete deindustrialization is probably not feasible or what we want, but do you think that there's any credence to the idea of halting the growth of like capitalist exploitation and like rethinking the presupposition of capital growth, and instead like finding alternate mindsets and different alternatives to our capital growth? And have you come across any alternatives that are exciting to you?
It's a very easy question. I will say, so Max Wilbur was the gentleman that I had the privilege of spending time with in Northern Nevada, and I would encourage you all to read that chapter. Shameless plug, please get a copy from our friends at Progress on your way out here. But Max is a fascinating person, very earnest in his approach to these issues. And I would say that is a perspective that we should completely deindustrialize, or at least start a deindustrialization. And I think it is part of the conversation and should be part of the conversation. But I think ultimately it's going to be up to us collectively to decide what that looks like. And, you know, I mean, it's low hanging fruit, but the argument that gets thrown around is, oh, well, he must use a car or a cell phone or a laptop. And he explains in the book why he does those things. But also he explains his approach or his rationale behind that. And he wrote a very popular book. He was on the front page of the New York Times. And so he is getting out there. And so I would just say, I might encourage you to say, what would you be willing to do, you know, to approach this issue, and sort of how would you look at extraction vis-a-vis our economy, and what would it look like if that changed? I think these have to be part of the broader conversations. Again, my opinion is just my opinion, but there's, you know, 80, 90 people in this room, and so that all matters as well, what you guys think about this stuff.
Thank you. Great presentation. Is this on? No. Okay. My voice carries a lot.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm just not going to use that thing.
I can repeat the question for our friends online.
Yeah. I want to talk just a little bit about the idea of social license.
Sure.
Because the implication of what you said was it's a social license in the local community. And that is the approach mining companies always take. You know, you're depriving jobs of the local community, and they try to build on this idea that it's what the local community wants is all that matters. I tell you what Ely wants certainly matters, but where Twin Metals wants to mine, for example, belongs to the people of the United States. The Boundary Waters Canary Wilderness belongs to the people of the United States. So you've got to, and the Superior National Forest, where most of the work would be, belongs to the people of the United States. So in that context, the social license has to come from the people of the United States, not from the people of Ely, Minnesota.
Sure, I would not disagree with you. I mean, I would say social license to operate, yes, does strongly depend on what local communities think, but also broadly what we as Americans broadly think as well. I would not sort of say it's just limited to one specific geographic location. So I would agree with you in that regard, that I think it is about more than just what a local community thinks. There's broader issues here as well.
My voice isn't as loud as my husband's. Ernie, thank you very much. And thank you for coming to Ely 2 years ago and highlighting our particular dilemma here. In our situation, we actually have grappled with the issue and it's been resolved. And so, but you know, you had said we need to grapple this. We as Americans aren't grappling with it.
Sure.
We have done that here. And in this area where the issue of federal public lands being developed for copper nickel mining, the federal government has said no. And it had multiple opportunities for input from public meetings, public comment period. And as of now, over time, 675,000 Americans have weighed in on whether or not there should be copper nickel mining immediately upstream of the boundary waters. And about over 90% of them say no. And so that really is where your social license is, but it also then led to a decision on January 26, 2023, by the Interior Secretary, Deb Haaland, to sign a public land order that removes all of the available federal public land in the headwaters of the boundary waters where there's a unified surface and mineral estate from mining for 20 years. So it's resolved. And so I just wanted to point that out, that we grappled with it. I think the federal government did an outstanding job of engaging the American people. They did an excellent study, citing science, covering the gamut from hydrology, geology to economics, and came to the conclusion that mining here posed an unacceptable risk to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, and the answer was no.
Thank you for your perspective, and thank you again for your time 2 years ago and all the successive times. Becky is part of the book for those who haven't read it, and as are several other people in this room. I would say that I still think broadly Americans especially haven't had to grapple with these broad core themes. And while certain communities may do it better than others, and I think there are several cited in the book that do it better than others, I think broadly we don't think through, this might sound elementary, but where our stuff comes from, and sort of where the places we're willing to allow production of the building blocks for those products, and where are we not. And so I think on a structural broad level, we're just not having that debate. I mean, we had the question about resolution earlier and water. Time and time again, a question I got from folks in Arizona is, why don't you get copper out of Minnesota? Because they have a lot of water there. That was a question I got time. And then of course there's perspectives in Minnesota and on water. That's obviously part of the key debate. And so I think on a national level, we are not grappling with this. Hi.
Speaking of which, why do Americans allow foreign investors to own and operate mining our resources? It happens here. I mean, everywhere, I'm sure. And like you said, Australia did the exploration in Nevada. Like, why are all these foreign companies? Why do we allow them to do that?
Well, Australia has a free trade deal with the U.S. and it's considered a strong ally. So it's not, the optics of that versus say, another country are a little different. There are several government bodies, one's known as CFIUS, which does review sort of deals that are considered potentially damaging to the U.S. national strategy. But I mean, if a company goes through the process and gets the permits, then it is able to move forward. Also, this doesn't affect Minnesota, but the law that's governed mining in the United States has been around since 1872. It was written to expand the United States West. 1872 was when Ulysses S. Grant was president. It was before cars were around. It was before cell phones. It was before laptops. So it was written for a very different time. It also means that companies that extract minerals on federal land in the US West do not have to pay royalties. And so that's, regardless of where your headquarters are. So as long as you get the operating permits and other necessary sign-offs. And I think folks have various different reactions. I mean, what you just asked, and thank you for your question, has been asked several times by doing book talks. And I would sort of just maybe turn the question around to you and just say, okay, it sounds based on your question that you don't like that. So what are the, things that you're willing to ask of your elected officials, policymakers, and others as we go into this energy transition? Because we didn't have this collective grappling 100 years ago, 150 years ago, when the petroleum-based economy took off. And what did we get out of that? We got armed conflicts. We got several wars related to crude oil. We got climate change, and we got OPEC. We have a cartel that controls roughly a third of the world's oil production. So if we're not careful, and I do argue this in the book, many of the same mistakes are going to be repeated as we continue to use more of these critical minerals. So what we demand of our elected officials, what we demand of companies that build the products that we buy every single day, it matters. I mean, I cite an analyst in the book, a very prominent one, that says we could have wars later this century over copper, which is sort of mind-boggling to think about, but it could happen because copper is really the anchor of this energy transition. It's in every single electronic device. And so these are the kind of things that we have to be thinking through. I do have a chapter in the book that talks about a Chinese company's investment in a rare earths mine in California that maybe would flesh out a little bit more some of your question there, and that help maybe paint the picture for you why the U.S. government looks at that project differently than they would perhaps the Australian company in Nevada.
Excellent job. Thank you. I have a 6-year-old here who has a question that he wants me to ask.
First off, we just say we have a 6-year-old interested in the mining topic. I think that needs a round of applause.
So he's wondering why you felt you had to write this book. Why did you write this book?
It's a very good question. Thank you for the question. Because I felt that this is a, you know, well, 2 reasons. If I didn't write it, somebody else was going to write it, so it might as well be me. And also, I'm really passionate about this question and this idea of choice. You know, this is my first book, and hardest thing I've ever done, and I've run 12 marathons, so this is definitely the hardest thing I've ever done. I would say that I learned at the end that you get to ask one question of your audience, and I realized that the one question that I'm asking the audience here is, what are the choices that we're willing to make if we want the energy transition? And so I really felt like putting that question in front of readers was really important. Hello.
I have to remember what I was going to ask now.
No pressure.
So I think you talked a little bit about the community and that kind of thing and the mine. But I think we have to also think of the community itself, because I think when a mine comes in, the community changes. All kinds of other people come in because all the expertise is not necessarily located in that community. So they have to bring a lot of other people in. And so that the community is helped, of course. The other people also change the community itself, so it looks differently. And I think some attention has to be given to that instead of overlooked.
I won't disagree with you. What I would just say, I think that should be part of a local dialogue, you know, if the local community feels that way. So I would just say that if local communities feel that way, they should definitely be debating that internally.
When you said feel that way, that sounds negative, but I think it is different.
I agree with you, and I hear that there's a deadline for running for mayor tonight, so maybe we've got a new candidate.
Could somebody check on the chat?
I learned a lot in reading your book, so thank you. It seemed like, Kate, your question about the globalization of who owns these companies. I learned that the US government and some of the choices that were made in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s set us up for, you know, not having chosen mining for these metals as part of our economic plan. And I guess I just wanted to bring that up to the audience and see if you wanted to elaborate on that point. But sometimes it seems like, okay, so now having not done that in the context that we're in, you know, what is the economic value of some of these landscapes? And is there a future in which the landscapes being maintained as is more economically beneficial to us than having mined them, given the fact that our government already made the choice to allow China to supersede us as in the metals kind of distribution economy.
Yeah, so the book does paint a picture over several hundred pages on the inaction by the U.S. government in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s around critical minerals, especially around education. And so I think there's to be 12 mining engineering programs in the United States right now. That's down sharply from mid 20th century, and also vastly less than China, where there's hundreds of mining engineering programs across mainland China right now. And they're just churning out graduates because they recognized years ago the strategic value of this area, and they invest capital, they invest person power. They certainly are growing rapidly, not only in their own borders, but across the world in a lot of areas. And one of the areas that I look at closely is rare earths. And this is the chapter I was alluding to the question here. It's rare earths are used to make magnets that turn power into motion. The thing that makes your cell phone vibrate is a rare earth magnet. The thing that takes power in an electric vehicle and basically translates the power from the battery into motion for your tires, that's a rare earth magnet. The United States basically invented the modern rare earths industry in the years after World War II, but slowly let that power atrophy. And then in the 1980s, China realized it had a lot of rare earths in its own borders and sort of started to amass the academic power in that space. And as the US was descendant in rare earths, China was ascendant. And so as we sit here today, China is the world's largest processor and producer of these critical minerals due to inaction on US policy. And so to my point earlier, inaction is a choice. And so yes, I guess you could argue that Washington let that happen. What is the answer? I mean, I think this is a policy question as much as it is a political question, but the answer is perhaps not to take China's lunch, but the answer could very well be seen as saying, well, we need to have these critical minerals, especially rare earths, in order to have many of the building blocks of our economy. So how do we look at ways to either increase domestic production or look at other technological advancements that could be made in that space? As we were saying earlier with the pandemic, I mean, having any one country corner the supply of any one product probably is not good for many reasons, not the least of which is national security. And so we did see China use its control of these areas as economic weapons. Is a key example I cite in the book from 2010 when China, amid a diplomatic spat with Japan, cut off exports of rare earths. It was only for a short period of time, but that set off our alarm bells in Tokyo and Washington as well, and showed that China was willing to do that. And so what does it look like to have production capability that doesn't rely on just one country? I think that's got to be part of the conversation here as well. I got my boss here, wherever he goes. Oh, there we go. Hi. Sure.
Info. Question. Not on. Which is only halfway up, sorry. I appreciate all the info and your willingness to come and share that with us today. Couple of questions or comments. I appreciate the fact of discussing all the changes that all the governments in the world are going through right now regarding this type of problem. And we definitely have to improve our side as far as I'm concerned. But I was wondering, with all the different mining situations that you ran across here with the different minerals, do you have any idea of how many of them failed? And whether they were domestic or international failures? Because we've all heard some of the horror stories of where we have a mine and mining and they close up overnight and they leave a mess and we're stuck with it type of thing. So I was just curious what you ran into from that side.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Do you mean failing from a safety perspective or economically failing and so the doors are bolted and closed? Do you mean failed from a safety perspective or failed from like an economic perspective? Oh, okay. Well, I don't have a hard and fast number for you, but certainly I would sort of agree with the premise of your question that yes, there unfortunately have been many instances where, over the course of the mining industry, mines do close due to economic factors. There's no way around the fact, obviously, that, mined products are commodities, and they price for them does rise and fall depending on the market factors. I mean, certainly in Appalachia, we have the story of many coal towns being affected by coal closures. Certainly here in the taconite part of the country, you know that all too well. Here in Ely, you know that all too well. What happened in the 60s and the 70s. It does happen. It is, when you look at the demand projections for a lot of critical minerals right now, though, it does indicate an upward trajectory. And these are from many agencies out there. We do know that copper prices are on the rise. There's been a huge increase in demand for copper, and it's very hard to build a copper mine right now. So that's fueling a lot of merger and acquisition activity across the world. So these are sort of the lay of the land right now, and from an economic perspective. But yes, I will grant you that has happened, as you and Ely know all too well. From a safety perspective, unfortunately, yes, there are accidents that do occur. And I do cite one in the introduction of the book about the Brumadinho tailings dam disaster in Brazil about 4 or 5 years ago. Tailings dams store the muddy detritus from a mining process, and basically just sort of stacked. There's a whole field of engineering that goes into studying and building them and monitoring them. Unfortunately, this one in Brazil was not monitored effectively, even though it was known to have a safety issue. And it collapsed in the middle of the lunch hour, and it killed 300 people. And this was not 50 years ago. This was 4 or 5 years ago. And so, yes, I mean, it is, it can be a very dangerous industry, depending. But what I would say coming out of that accident is that it marshaled a huge push, not only in the industry, but I think more importantly in the industry's investors and other NGOs to say this can't happen again. And so we're starting to see a lot of pressure being put on the industry to improve its safety and also to be more transparent around monitoring of these facilities. And so the Church of England, as one example, uses the pension fund for its retirees. So you think retired priests and nuns, basically using the 2 or 3 billion pounds they have at their disposal to say to some of these big mining companies, you got to clean up your act. And we want more transparency around tailings dam disclosure. We want to know how these are built. We want to outlaw certain types of design for tailings dams. And we want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So that is getting a lot more attention.
You mentioned the greatest source of copper in the United States was in our kitchen drawers and our closets, in our old cell phones and things. I'm curious if there's, at this point, economic viability in recycling of copper, and if it's something that is being looked at by this administration and some of its climate activities.
So yes, recycling is getting a lot more attention, and the IRA, as well as several other pieces of legislation that Congress passed and President Biden signed, do include some funding for recycling. So it's just going to take a while to build out the physical infrastructure. The recycling chapter, which I think you'll enjoy based on this question, looks at sort of an unexpected challenge to recycling. And it's not necessarily the technology, it's actually the logistics. Because think about having 400 old cell phones sitting in a bin. Each cell phone, even if it's decharged, might have a 1 or 2% charge. Well, that's still 1 or 2% charge multiplied by 400 or 500 cell phones. And sometimes, if you have an accident or one's damaged, they could all explode. And so logistics can be a huge impediment to recycling. And recycling facilities are large industrial facilities, and so sometimes that might not be fully supported by the local populace. These are all part of the equations as well, in addition to just the sheer challenge of whether you use what's called like hydrometallurgical or pyrometallurgical recycling, sort of 2 main ways to recycle products. And that chapter goes through 2 companies taking 2 different approaches to it. But at its core, that chapter explores also, hey, like there's a logistical challenge here. We have to be building out the network for recycling. And also, I would say, just as an addendum to that, it can be done. If you have an internal combustion engine powered vehicle, most of us in this room do, you use a lead acid battery. And what you don't realize is when that battery dies, you turn it in and buy a new one, but you don't even realize that like the purchase price for that new lead acid battery includes a few bucks that pays for the recycling of that old dead lead acid battery. because the US government instituted this program years ago. Now it just operates behind the scenes. So there's this entire industry for just recycling and reusing lead acid batteries that we don't even think about. We just pay for it. So what would it look like to sort of have that set up for lithium ion batteries? I mean, the chemistries can be different. The size certainly can be different. So there's some technical challenges there, but I'm curious of where this goes in the future.
Bernie, I want to ask this in the context of the conversation around Minnesota. We still have North Met that is being discussed. There's Talon that's being discussed. So like the copper nickel and metals discussion is still happening in Minnesota and in St. Paul. And I'm curious what, through your reporting, what you've seen communities grappling with these conversations, and the companies and the communities and the policymakers grappling with this. Like, what does that look like if you've seen it, or it's moved forward in a meaningful way, at least some of this discussion?
Well, I think there's still a lot of discussion certainly out there. You mentioned two projects. I mean, Polymet and Talon are you know, sort of going through those machinations right now with state and other regulators. And I mean, I do not want to preempt those processes, but they're ongoing right now. I mean, I think there was like another event last week with Polymet, if I remember correctly. I'd have to triple check. But it is, to your point, still part of these broader conversations. Both of those projects are in various stages of regulatory review or court review, and they each have opposition from certain communities. And so I think that is also part of the collective grappling that has to take place here. And both of those projects, you know, have been, well, I should say, Polymet's been on the drawing board for a very long time. And so now they've got a new owner, or a joint owner, I should say, which is a joint venture. So how that changes the conversation, I think, will be pretty interesting. And then Talon has to deal with Tesla. And so they're going to be processing in North Dakota. So will that sort of change the rubric? We'll see.
Just a follow-up.
Yeah.
So in these other communities around the US, how are those conversations shaping up? Like, are you seeing the community and the companies and then getting in the same room having like a meaningful conversation? Or is it just kind of this loggerhead?
I think it depends on the situation. I mean, some host communities do talk to companies, and they are having conversations. Some mines are literally in the middle of nowhere, so there is no host community, or you know, there might be one or two people for 1,000 or 2,000 square miles. So it really all depends, I think. There is a chapter in the book that I look at Perpetual Resources attempts to reopen an antimony mine in northern Idaho in the middle of nowhere. Antimony is used to harden bullets, and it also is used to make solar panels and some batteries. And so this company that wants to develop it, which is controlled by John Paulson, the company sort of very shrewdly wrapped its project in the green energy transition veneer. And their main community that they have to work with is a group of Native Americans that are very focused on salmon. Think about northern Idaho, salmon runs are huge there. And so that is part of their community outreach. But these communities don't live anywhere near the mine site, but there's streams that go all through the area. So like having those discussions with that community is a core part of trying to get that license to operate. And it's over salmon there. So that's sort of one specific example there. And those dialogues are ongoing. But it looks different for each proposed project across the country.
Lacey had a question that brought this into the mind. In our particular situation with proposed mining in the headwaters, the boundary waters, the economics on jobs and income favor no mine. But there's another aspect to this, and I'm wondering if you run into it, and that's ecosystem services. So when Lacey was asking what's the value of the landscape, services are provided by having clean water. Services are provided by having clean air. And economists have, for a number of years, figured out how to monetize the value of clean air, clean water, and other services nature provides. I'm just wondering, in your conversations across the country with communities that are grappling with extractive industries, mining, does the term ecosystem services and the values that are embodied in that come up, or is that something that's no longer considered in the dialogue?
Well, I think it depends on the region or the state. And the two examples that just came to mind as you were asking your question, Becky, were Nevada and Arizona. Arizona has a miner on its state flag. And so mining has been a part of the state's economy for a very long time, but it's also got a huge outdoor culture. And so a lot of folks were talking about, can these two coexist? At least a lot of local elected officials I talked to said that their ideal would be to have them coexist. Like the resolution example, there's a giant hiking trail that goes right next to the proposed mine site. And there's also a giant copper mine 10 miles down the road. And another one, I mean, that region is called the Copper Corridor. And so multiple local elected officials in Arizona told me that. I mean, Nevada, just look at the motto or the nickname for Nevada, you know, I mean, they rely a lot on mining. It tends to be more sparsely populated than Minnesota or Arizona. And so their approach to outdoor recreation is a little different. So I would say it's subjective based on what part of the country, at least from my reporting for the book, was subjective. I mean, not too many people are looking to go hike Silver Peak Range in Nevada. I mean, some do, but it's not sort of a built up tourism economy as it say like northern Minnesota. So I would say it's subjective to the regions that I was visiting for the book.
Then the value of clean air and clean water.
Okay.
The outdoor economy leads to jobs and income. Right now we have clean air and clean water. If we didn't have clean air and clean water, we'd have dirty air and dirty water, and we'd have to clean it up. So it has a value. That's where I'm going.
Right.
And there used to be, it was popular maybe 6 or 8 years ago, ecosystem services reports that valued that component. So rather than just looking at jobs and income, you also looked at what nature gave you and what happened if you lost that aspect of the nature and what the value of that was, which is the delta between cleaning it up and not having to clean it up.
Sure, and I would say that definitely has to be part of the conversation, not to sort of skirt around your question, but I think people have to be debating this, right? I mean, do we, you know, I mean, if we put a mine here, you know, we know that there are safeguards in place. We know that there'll be monitoring, et cetera, et cetera. Are we willing to, you know, if there is an accident, you know, how does this, you know, factor into our calculus? And I think that has to be part of the conversations that people have. And I don't think they do this collectively now. I think there are pockets of communities across the country that do it, but I don't think as a group en masse, people, you know, collectively do that. And that's why I really wanted to write this book to our young friends' question. You know, I mean, this is an area that I think we have to be thinking about more. You know, can recreation coexist with mining, or should we favor one or the other, or neither, or what would it look like to make our way through that really tough, sticky question? And so that's really why I wrote the book. I really want people to have to actually sort of sit in this. It's an uncomfortable, sticky situation. There's no easy answers, but all of you have to be making a decision.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. Jerry, to your question, I mean, I know in Ely that we've started an Ely chapter, Ely Alliance with the Braver Angels National Organization. And we've been waiting to debate the issue, well, not debate, discuss the issue of copper nickel mining in the region, knowing that we want to have our chapter more fully formed before we get into something that will be such a juicy topic. But Ernie, I'm really grateful to you in your book because I think it is a tool for discussion and it really does challenge us to think about this issue, grapple with it, and consider the choices that we do have. So I thank you all for being a part of this conversation here today. A quick plant the seed that next week's Tuesday group is another edition of Meet New Elyites. So please, we'll see you next week. But for now, thank you for your questions. Thank you for being curious. Thank you for being learners. And Ernie, thank you.
Thank you all.